Excellent. Well, that was inspiring to me. I hope I can do half as well. So my name is Russ Conser. I've recently retired from Shell, where I led an innovation program called Game Changer. It's been around for 15 years. I've been leading it for the last 7, where we invested in people with crazy ideas that could change the game of energy. I said I've recently retired. I'm basically, my wife and I, Nancy, if some of you may meet her, who's with me here today, we're off traveling around the country for a little while before I embark on another 30-year career. So anyhow, a pleasure to be here at the ULI and share with you a few thoughts. So the title of my talk is Revolution by Evolution. And although typically when we give a short talk in 15 minutes, we say, make one point simply, I decided to try to weave in 3 that I'll try to, because it really went through my mind, how do I make this relevant to the Urban Land Institute and what you're interested in? So I'll try to share with you some of my insights on how revolutionary innovation happens, on what's happening in energy that might be related to that, and then maybe some impacts on land as well. So, and I'm pretty sure there's no one in this room that's ever read a book called Energy, the Engine of Revolution by a friend of mine, Frank Nela. But the first idea I want to lay in front of you is that the land of planet Earth is basically a story of land being transformed by transformations in the energy system over time. Early energy came from heat, then the sun. Then as the sun, the plants that took the sunlight made oxygen, plants that could then take oxygen carried on, and so on. And each one has involved a shift in time. And I think, and many people seem to think, that we're at a point where our society is shifting from fossil fuels as a source of energy to something else, where there are many candidates in play. Now, in the context of revolutionary innovation, one of the things a lot of people, I think, misunderstand that's a subtlety, but it's a significant one, is that these revolutionary changes don't happen because some magic pops out of the sky and transforms the Earth instantaneously. The way revolutions happen is through evolution in such a way that small attributes that are valued in unique local settings get their start, and then only after time they grow and become more common in the mainstream. And so what looks like a staircase of change over time, if we look at it, is really a series of small overlapping S-curves. And so the metaphor for that I want to use today as I go through my talk is a shifting from ideas that start in small ponds that then move into lakes, that then move into oceans. And this is really a dynamic that becomes important. And one of the biggest mistakes that even large corporations, like my own former employer, make routinely when we think about how do we change the game of something. Now, these S-curves are common in anything. I've never seen any industry that hasn't been transformed in something like an S-curve. And I gave a talk one time just about the beginning of the S-curve to show people that there's a lot of magical things that really happen there. The ideas that I want to throw in here today is to build on that evolutionary metaphor and say the best way to think of new ideas are as genes that get their start in those little backwater ponds. It's important to understand, therefore, that those ponds are not in the center of an ocean, and they're usually somewhere out of the way. I don't know where bike sharing started, Gabe, but I think Paris was early. Mm-hmm. Some of these places. But then once it was proven in one place, it became very popular, and cities going, hey, this is great. And so that's an S-curve. And that was probably 15 years ago, maybe or so. And yeah, so these things then take off fast once they've shown their local merit. It is observable if you look on small scales when it's happening. Now, the big innovations that happen as they aggregate then form the genetics, the full DNA of innovation. But that only comes after you've gone through the pond, and then the growth that you'll see comes from that proving of success. So genes and DNA. To use a little example here that I'll come back to a bit, is when revolutionary innovation happens in the early days of something, let's take the bike thing, the very first people that get involved in that, they want to get to work fast, they still live in the suburbs, they have to get there. You've got to find a niche where, there's some little piece of relevance that makes it relevant. So there's weak incentives for the mainstream to adopt these revolutionary changes early that only take place over time. Now, once they do, what you see is everything shifts, right? So if you were in the early, the turn of the 20th century, horse and buggy would still be the way to get around, and you'd only be driving an automobile if you knew things about mechanics and and how to take care of things. But over time, of course, the horse and carriage becomes the entertainment, and the automobile becomes the dominant mode of transportation. So in the context, and I heard the gentleman say as he was introducing today that places like Houston are being transformed by the changes in the energy system. One that's transforming the United States, at least right now, and potentially globally, is the so-called shale gale, or the unconventional gas revolution. A lot of people seem to be caught by surprise with that revolution around the mid-2000s. And I think what I show you here is the growth of that unconventional gas compared to conventional gas. And what you see is that it's a much steadier trend. That if you look early on in a revolution, you can kind of see it happening long before it comes. And in fact, if we, I'm going to play a few tricks here today with some charts to show that if we proportion these things on kind of the old system versus the new system, it starts following some very simple equations that are drawn from evolutionary biology on how change happens. So if I actually go in and apply this now to that unconventional shale gas industry that's transforming our landscape, what you'll see is a big S-curve if I go back and put it on this linear scale that actually goes way back into time, decades before. And some of these things that you've heard are the key genes that have enabled that revolution, got their start decades ago. The first shale gas well in North America was actually in the 1800s in New York. The first horizontal wells in the 1920s, the first fracking in the 1940s. So the thing that's the revolution is not the invention of the gene, it's the bringing together in a system into that DNA thing, where people like George Mitchell and Mitchell Energy approved it in one place, the equivalent of Paris bike sharing, and then it took off and a whole bunch of other inventions helped make it better and grow over time. Now, one of the things I'm going to try to show you here in the next couple of slides is that this pattern is repeated in just about every domain, at least in energy, but I've applied it in many others as well. If I plot this on a particular set of scales where there's this population of new entrants versus others, and I have a logarithmic scale there on the left, we can see that these patterns start early and then play out linearly over time. So that line you see is calculated from just the data in the little box down there. And you can see that basically we could have predicted the evolution of the energy, the gas energy system back in the 1990s simply by looking at data this way. This is the one I want you to remember more importantly, which is if I do that same thing to other energy systems, but now I go down where places where I have data that goes down much below what we might say is the limit of detectability, I can see the emergence of the nuclear energy revolution. I can see how the USA was on it. That little kink there is right at 3 Mile Island in the 1970s, and the French kept going, and they continued to transform their landscape. You can see this German solar revolution that many of you in real estate must be aware of at least. The US wind industry, which has grown significantly, you can see already at less than 10% of the market shows this same trend of a revolution coming, as well as the solar photovoltaic industry, which is probably impacting a number of you as developers already in cities. You can see very early on here from 2008 through 2012 that there's already a pattern forming of a revolution coming. The trick and the aha here now in terms of the ponds, lakes, and oceans, these charts like this, I'll give you a microscope to look at the small scale. Now, if I go back to that linear scale like I showed you on the gas picture before, you'll see that all that data I showed you, with the exception of the nuclear, is down at a level where you would never notice it. It's really, really subtle changes happening on the edges of the landscape. But look at what those curves would do if they continue on. You would see that the wind energy in the US would reach 25% here within the next several years. The solar photovoltaic trend may not become too noticeable to the average person until the 2020s or 2030s, but look what happens after that. So if this is things like building integrated solar, rooftop solar, you can see these types of things become quite significant in our lifetimes, and certainly in the lifetime of the real estate that you might develop. So some lessons from this kind of model of revolutionary evolution. First, if you're trying to start a revolution, there was a famous movie about the electric car, and I hope I don't offend any General Motors people who might be in the audience here today, but I believe that the electric car that General Motors tried to launch was dead the day it was introduced. because they tried to target the average Los Angeles commuter. And that's the equivalent of trying to launch a revolutionary innovation in an ocean. It won't work, so don't do that. And at the same time, if you're looking for coming trends in revolutions, don't look at the oceans. You gotta look at the small ponds. So Elon Musk came along and did the Tesla Roadster, and the thing he did very different from General Motors was, how do I sell a few thousand of these things to rich movie stars and get them to be very public about it to get more people interested? That's the equivalent of targeting a pond with a revolutionary innovation. So when you watch places like this, I used to talk to my Shell friends who are really serious about the potential impact of electrical mobility, and they spend too much time looking at oceans and not enough time looking at ponds. So that's a key lesson. Another lesson in here is there's no such thing as one pond for all innovations. So a lot of revolutionary innovations will come out of small ponds, and they're different small ponds. So be looking at the small scale for interesting things happening that have the potential to grow if they work, and most of them won't, by the way. A lot of biological evolution, of course, never sees its way out of the pond. So if this metaphor of evolution as a model for revolution is valid, honestly, over time, many other dynamics included as well, I've come to view innovation with what to me feels like the wonder of a naturalist, which itself makes me wonder, does nature have other lessons? So before I close my part here, I want to try to make a connection back to nature itself, and then how that might connect to land. So back to this chart I showed you earlier. I'm going to point to one of these steps, even though each one of them has something similar involved in it. But this transition from basically cyanobacteria that lived in oceans that took sunlight and built body mass out of them, when they were developing and growing as a population of species on this planet, they were emitting oxygen. That oxygen was a byproduct to them. It was low concentration at first, but as they started growing, oxygen that was just a waste product to them was toxic to themselves as well. So in essence, life was emitting a byproduct that was killing itself over time. The way that life solved that problem is prior to the Oxian revolution, nutrients would move around in the ecosystem through long distances. What happened there is that some smart, clever little cell figured out how to integrate this energy production system inside of it. You and I know it as mitochondria today. Every cell in our body has that in there. And by integrating the energy production system inside the cellular metabolism, it fundamentally changed the dynamics. So this is the analogy that I'd like to make with respect to land. I feel that some of these things that are going on in energy are of a similar nature, where we're going from places where we produce fossil fuels at distance, ship them around the world, to things like when we start integrating energy production systems in the cells, so buildings, can we become more capable? And just like the human body could only grow arms, legs, and heads once it had this capability, what do our cities do as we start to build in cells that have integrated capabilities? To take the final, to try to really stretch your mind a bit, here in a lead into the next speaker, I saw Ron at TED earlier this year, and also another gentleman by the name of Alan Savory. They made two key points to me. They said in the rest of the system, there's some symbiotic things happening. People are getting healthier when we're moving food production back to our cities. And what Alan Savory said is, in order to make our air and water healthier, we need to move some things back to the rural countryside. So there was a concept in the 1990s when the IT revolution was kicking off, presented by Nicholas Negroponte of MIT, that took on the term trading places, where basically only due to an accident of technology did we have things, basically our voice and landline and TVs going through the air, and that was going to turn upside down. So it's made me wonder whether there's something similar that may be happening here with regard to our energy and built environment systems. Could it be that the energy and food production systems start moving back towards the cities at the same time that some of these things that we used to handle in terms of flood control, in terms of cleaning air, start moving back to the land. And therefore, is there not only an important symbiosis in the things we do in our cities, but an interplay between the cities and the countrysides? Well, to try to tie it all back together here in this braided weave that I've tried to create, I'll recap the main points. That energy revolutions have driven evolution itself. Hopefully I left you with some understanding that revolutions happen by evolutionary processes. That this concept of how they work is when the new idea genes get started in backwater ponds. That the growth happens only later when those genes come together to form new types of DNA. That you can actually see this early stage growth in these ponds if you look at it with that graphical microscope trick that I showed. That we can see this in real world examples. This natural gas revolution that seems to have changed our country today started decades ago. It didn't start recently. I further believe that there are new energy revolutions underway. We can see those with our microscope today. Some of those revolutions may involve urban and rural roles trading places, but something overall tells me that there's a new symbiosis, whether it's within cities or between cities and countrysides, that's going to be central to the next revolution. Thanks.